Hi, my name's Miles Toulmin. I'm the pastor of HTBB, Holy Trinity Bukit Bintang, here in the center of KL. I also work overseeing the ministry of Alpha across Asia Pacific. And I just want to begin by saying thank you for being here, for listening, and we love DUMC. What an amazing church, pioneered so much of what God's done through his church here in the Klang Valley and the whole of the country and beyond. And we love your pastors. Pastor Chris Cam and Stella are amazing. Obviously, Daniel Ho and Doris, what an amazing set of leaders you have at DUMC. And it's a huge privilege to be invited to say a few words. The topic for this session is how do we engage with millennials? And I'm going to say a few words in the second half, but to try and illustrate one of the important parts is we've also got a colleague of mine, Abel Chia, who's going to come and speak and do the first half. He himself is a millennial. Abel is a fantastic guy. He's married to Jacintha, and he works for Alpha Malaysia, but he also pastors our 5 p.m. service at HTBB and oversees the youth at the church, and is doing an amazing job. So first of all, I just want to say thank you and hand you over now to Abel.
Hey, thank you so much, Miles, and thank you once again for having us here for this session. I always think that when we talk about topics like engaging the millennials, we tend to fall into one of 3 categories. The first is we might fall into the trap of caricaturizing the generations, kind of painting broad brushes across generations, thinking of them a certain way and kind of putting them all in that bucket. But that would be a mistake. And I like to think of it as the old boy syndrome. You know how in school, as you look back, when you graduate and look back on your juniors, you realize at that moment that the juniors would never be as glorious as your batch. That's the old boy syndrome. And we should not fall into that as we talk about any generation for that matter. The second trap that we might fall into is the trap of apathy, that in our lack of understanding or in our frustration in trying to understand the millennials, we kind of decide to let our hands off and not care. But I think generations have their own story, and while they have their own history, it's very important to understand, where they've come from. And so the third approach to understand millennials is to take one of learning. And what I hope we get from this session today is to eat the fish but spit out the bones, to take what applies, what you think is useful, but always with a pinch of salt as well. I love this quote by George Orwell, who says, "Every generation imagines itself to be a little more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it." So let's not fall into the trap, but really let's take that learning stance as we talk about the millennials. I'm a millennial myself, and Miles is from what we call Generation X, and we all have our kind of different features and characteristics, but really, all of us, we have our own kind of our stories and what the history or the features of each generation are. So I like this slide about generational differences. Again, a mistake would be to look at this slide and to caricaturize the generations. I think everyone who falls into one of these buckets is definitely all of this. But I just find this helpful to understand that each generation has a different story. And in particular, when you look at history, what happens with the birth of each generation, you understand their motivations and their push and pull factors as well. At HTBB, we have a huge demographic of millennials. About 66% of our church are 35 years and below. And I think that a huge part or the reason why the millennial population is growing is really because of the leadership of Miles and Sarah, our lead pastors. They may not be millennials themselves, but because they're empowering and because there are intentional leadership decisions in terms of raising the next generation. We're seeing, a really healthy number of millennials in the church. And so I just want to share 2 points, 2 lessons that we've learned in our history, our story so far at H2BB. We're 3.5 years and growing, and we've just learned a few lessons in the past few years. The first is culture is everything. And we say that because culture is, a set of behaviors or systems or processes that are either defined or undefined, but they really inform our behaviors and the way we live. And at H2BB, while we don't have a millennial strategy, I have to admit, we don't have, kind of a 5-year plan on how to increase the number of millennials in our church. We do have a growing emphasis on what our culture is and how do we replicate our culture across the connect groups, across our alpha terms as well. And so about a year ago, we set out as a leadership team to define and really work through what it means to have a HTBB personality and what really distinguishes us as a church. And we learned that culture is not just caught, it's also taught. You've got to have both. Think of it like 2 hands. You have to model culture and lead by example, and at the same time, as the church grows to a critical mass, the contact time of the church with your senior leadership will get lesser and lesser, and so you do need to teach to an extent so that the culture is replicated as well. And I like to think of culture in terms of using a metaphor of cycling. And I wonder whether you're familiar with cycling. I used to grow up cycling in my neighborhood, tearing apart the streets with my bicycle. And I think that culture is to leadership what paddling is to cycling. And what do I mean by that? Well, I can share by telling you this story about this cycling experience that I had a few years ago. So when I was just about 1 month away from marrying my wife, my then girlfriend, now wife, Jacinta, we decided to go for one last hurrah, a kind of big significant date before we got married 1 month later. And so I decided to bring her to this place called Pulau Ketam, which is off the coast of Klang. And if you know Pulau Ketam well, or if you've been there before, then you would know that it's a rather small fishing village. It's very quaint, and it's such a great place for seafood, but it's not exactly, modern like KL as well. So the lanes in Pulau Ketam are quite narrow, and there aren't big lanes enough for motorized vehicles, except for bicycles and motorcycles. And the whole plan that I had for this trip was that we would go there, we would cycle into the sunset, enjoy seafood, and as she enjoy her fried fish or salted egg mantis prawn, she would know without a doubt that Abel is the man for her. So that was the big plan to bring her for that big last date. And so off we went to Pulau Ketam. We went onto the boat and we started heading towards the island. And then when we arrived, I discovered that, I didn't know this, but Jacinta doesn't cycle. And so I had to really improvise. And we went to this bike shop, and I found this really big bike with a bike seat at the back. And I basically had to do the cycling for us. But she thought, actually, it's okay if I do the cycling for us, because then, she would have to hold on tight. So it was actually, it kind of worked out well for us as well. And so I cycled, for the both of us, it was very heavy. And I cycled, across the island, and as we were cycling, we were really enjoying ourselves. And we reached this part of the island where we had to make a turn at this junction to get to a jetty with a really good view of the sea. And as we were reaching that junction, I realized suddenly that I was going downhill, and I was going downhill quite fast. And as I was going downhill quite fast, I realized that my brakes were not working. I just couldn't engage them. And before we knew it, we hit a hole at the end of the road, and we were both flying in the air, and we landed in this great pile of dust, bike metal, and blood. It was a horrible crash. And because it was a small island, and there was a school to our right, and an old folks hall on our left, everyone came out to kind of see the both of us on the floor, these two clueless city kids sitting in this cloud of dust. And so we were really embarrassed, and we dusted off our knees, we got back on the bicycle, and then we got off to the end of the jetty. We had a really good time there, and then it was time for dinner. So we started cycling again, and I started cycling towards the restaurant. And to get to the restaurant, I had to go back to the same road, the road that we fell at. And so we were on our way, and I started cycling. And before I realized it, again, we were going downhill. And again, we were going downhill really fast. And again, I realized the brakes were not working. And so, bam, we hit the same pothole at the same spot just half an hour ago, and we both flew up into the air, and it was almost slow motion because the fall was especially bad this time. I landed kind of on my bottom, and as I landed on my bottom, I realized that the ground wasn't very hard. It was actually quite soft, and I realized that, well, it didn't even feel like the ground. It felt like a face, the face of my wife. And 1 month later, we got married. And I often think back to this story about how, cycling involves a lot of mechanics, right? You have to coordinate yourself a lot when you cycle. There's a lot of things that happen when you cycle. You have to pedal, you have to steer your bicycle, you have to look out for the potholes on the road. And I think of culture as the pedaling to a bicycle. We know that with a bicycle, you do need direction, and I think of the handle as kind of a metaphor for vision in leadership. You need to steer the bicycle, you need to know where you're going. But we also know that the handle doesn't actually make the bicycle move. It just provides direction. What actually makes the bicycle move forward is the act of pedaling consistently, frequently, and to make sure that you have balance as you move forward. And that's like culture. You have to make culture visible, you have to make it consistent, and you have to make it frequent. And so the lesson that we learned at the Alpha Hub, where the church is located, is that we needed to make it consistent, visible, and frequent. We needed to talk about it in a language that everyone could understand, and we needed to do it in a way where it was a two-way exchange as well. Often organizations make the mistake of imposing culture on their teams. That doesn't work because then it's not sustainable when the leaders leave. Culture needs to be built from both ways. Leaders need to model it and communicate it clearly, but also you need to have platforms of people negotiating with the culture and really working through the culture as well. And so at the Alpha Hub, we do this thing every month called the Hub Culture Sessions, where every month we look at values and behaviors and practices like giving and receiving feedback or building self-awareness. We deliver some content, and then we get teams to really work through what this means for themselves and to really dialogue about this and think about how this could affect their daily work. And we're doing that in HTBB, we're doing that through our Connect groups, in the Connect group trainings, but also we do that through the various programs within our church. And I'm going to talk about Alpha in a moment because Alpha is a massive culture building tool that we use in church. It's our main church growth engine, but we've found that it also has built such a great millennial culture within our church as well. And you would see on our slides also some of our Alpha Hub culture statements. There are 12 values that we have, and the way we cut it up is we have values, behaviors, personalities, and then we have a last column there, to ground us in terms of what these values are, what they mean for us theologically as well. I love what Max Dupree says about leadership. He says, the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. In between a leader is a servant. And I love this definition because really as leaders, we have to define reality. We have to really state what's going on. At the same time, defining reality doesn't mean just to tell everyone what the temperature of the room is. It's also to be a thermostat. It's to set the temperature as well. And I think of defining reality as shaping reality as well. And you only do that when you're conscious about the culture that you have, and when you're conscious about inviting people into, working out the culture as well. So if you look at our slides, you will see that our value statements are all about empowering others. We have some values there about, one of our values is the meaning of life is to love and be loved. We also have everyone has value and potential. Unity is a big one for us, and loyalty matters. And how this plays out, maybe I can give you an example of how the value of loyalty matters plays out in our day-to-day church life. So we always say everyone has a voice. We even have a statement that says obligation to dissent, but ultimately loyal. And what that means is every one of us has a different perspective, and actually we're not just encouraged to share our perspectives and what we see. We're obligated to share it. If you see something, if you have a voice, you better say it, because that's an obligation. That creates, a feedback environment where the best decisions can be made. But once you have voiced your opinions, then you're ultimately loyal as well to your lead pastor or to your head of department, to whoever has authority in that room. And you trust ultimately that the decision would have considered all the options and the decision is the best one for the team. And what that means is if you're a millennial in a senior leadership team meeting, you'd be encouraged and you'd feel safe to share your opinions. And we would even say that's part of our culture. You better share it if you see it. But then at the same time, we share it in a way that's respectful, that's equally empowering of the leadership as well in the room. And then ultimately, we trust that the decision of the leader is one that has weighted all options and one that is wise as well. So that's the first lesson that we've learned in terms of engaging millennials. Culture is everything. The second lesson that we've learned in the past few years is to put on the platform the people that you want to reach. And that basically means that if we are trying to reach a particular demographic of people in the population, then it's that population that we will put on the platform, because really the people that you put on the platform will be replicated in terms of the people who come in through the doors as guests as well. As I said earlier, 66% of HTBB's demographic is below 35 years old. And I think it's not an accident that it's that way, because if you look at the activities of the church, you would see that most of the people on the platform are below 35 years old as well. You'd see that in the worship and production crew. You'd see that in the budding preachers who take the platform on Sundays to preach. You'd see that in the Alpha hosts and the Alpha small group hosts and helpers as well. You'd see that in the Connect group leaders as well. So there's a very intentional, way of raising people up. And it's very clear in the way Miles and Sarah lead the church. They put millennials on the platform as well. And you would also see the slide about our growth trajectory over the last 3 years. HTBB has been privileged to see just a really healthy growth rate over the last few years. And again, this graph correlates our church growth with how frequently we do Alpha. And as I said, our culture has to be built on a consistent and frequent basis. And so our growth engine at church is Alpha, but also we've found that Alpha builds culture because it's done consistently, and leaders are always raised to lead their small groups, and really the bar to leadership is low with Alpha as well. And we've done over 10 Alpha terms since HTBB started, and we've seen the growth of the church correlate to the number of Alphas being done as well. So we believe that's also really one of the reasons why we've seen not just a growth in the church numbers, but also a growth in terms of the numbers of millennials. And now I'm just going to pass it over to Miles for the third lesson. Thank you.
Thank you, Abel. Yeah, the third point really that we have in how to engage and get the best out of working with and reaching and working with millennials is this. It's really important that they have a voice and they feel valued. That they feel valued and they have a voice. Last year, I had the privilege of going to a lecture here in KL that was given by SMU, the Singapore Management University. And what their panel of speakers said was that throughout the whole region, large corporations and even mid-sized corporations were facing a challenge. And the biggest challenge that they had was how to retain millennials as staff. So what they were seeing again and again were that millennials were graduating from college and university, applying for jobs, getting a job maybe in a big multinational, let's say a big bank, and they'd start work at the bank, and their job was to each day fill out data on a spreadsheet. And what they saw happening was, for the first couple of months, they'd sit there every day, and the graduates would, the new employees would fill out the spreadsheet. But by the time they got to about 3 months in, they were thinking, what's the point of this? I'm not really valued. If I don't turn up to work tomorrow, so what? Somebody else will just fill out the spreadsheet. And then what they were finding is that by the 6-month point, they'd handed in their notice, and there's a huge exodus of millennials from big business right now, right across this region. It's a huge issue that they're facing. And what do millennials go on to do? Well, a lot go on to do startups, become entrepreneurs, maybe get 2 other friends and start an artisan coffee shop or something. Why? Well, first of all, if you're part of a startup, then what you do is valued. If you don't turn up to work tomorrow and there's only 2 other members of staff, then they notice that you're missing. And there's a problem if you're not there, because who's going to do your work? But secondly, if you're part of a small startup, you have a voice. What you do has a direct impact on the direction and scale of what you achieve. So if you don't turn up to work, then the startup's not going to work, because you can see directly the impact that you're having. You have a voice. And so these 2 things are really important. How do we give young people value, make them feel valued, and also give them a voice so they can see the impact that they're having, so they can feel and see the purpose that they're working out in their life. And it's for a similar reason that throughout the US, what they've seen is that millennials, generally speaking, do not like megachurch. Why? Same reason. They maybe turn up at a big megachurch, they sit in a chair at the back, then they leave. They come back the next week, they sit in the same chair, then they leave. By week 3, they're thinking, well, what's the point of this? If I don't turn up next Sunday, somebody else will sit in that chair. Nobody's going to know. And anyway, even if I do keep on sitting on that chair, what can I really contribute to the direction and impact of this church? Yeah, maybe I can join a hosting team or something, but I don't really have an impact or a voice in something this big. Now, that's not to say that millennials can't love megachurches. Of course they can. You just have to get intentional about engaging them, and especially in these 2 areas of value and voice. And what we've seen in the Alpha small group is actually that is a place where everyone has value and has a voice. So if you don't come back to the Alpha small group, maybe there's 10, 12 people in it, then, where's Dave this week? You notice that he's not there. And somebody might check, are you okay? So you're valued. But also, the purpose of the small group is peer-to-peer learning. You listen to one another. You say to people, what do you think? What do you feel? It's like, hey, you want to listen to what I've got to say? And everybody's contribution helps directly impact and guide the discussion and the journey of spiritual exploration that you're going on. So what we find is that the Alpha small group is very attractive to millennials because it's a place where there's value and voice. It's also why in the church world, millennials are fantastic to recruit to go on church plants. If you're planting a church, it's kind of the church world's equivalent of doing a startup, right? Of launching your own coffee shop or something, because it starts with a small team. You start with a blank piece of paper, and everyone on that team has value, and you have a significant voice and the ability to impact on a disproportionate scale what happens in that church plant. So if you're ever into church planting or you're thinking of planting, then millennials make great startup team members, and they're hugely talented by and large, and will make a massive impact. Or if you're not church planting, maybe there's a new ministry you're thinking of starting up in your church, or a new initiative, or a new team. Anything new, small, startup within your existing church. Also, that's going to be attractive to millennials because they have value and voice. The one other thing you might need to do, though, is, and we've tried to do this a little bit at HTBB, but like Abel said, we're just learning. We're by no means experts in this area. But you've got to be prepared to have what I call an expanding top table. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got to invite young people into the leadership conversations. And what we do, and part of the advantage we have at HTBB is we're not that massive as a church, and when you're a bit smaller, scale works in your favor. But what we do is we have just one meeting every week where we discuss, it's the key meeting for planning what's happening in the church in the weeks and months ahead. And that happens on a Tuesday, and we do it from 11 a.m. through to about 1. So it's a 2-hour meeting. And everybody can sit around that table. So even the young intern that we have, he or she gets to sit at that top table where all the key leadership decisions are going to be made. Now, there might be some things that you say, look, are too sensitive for everybody to be in the room. That's fine. You can offline those particular conversations afterwards. But the key decision-making meeting, we say, okay, let's have an expanding top table. Everyone is allowed to sit at it. Because not only might their voice be really important to hear in making a wise decision, but also that's a really important part of leadership development. Those other people can sit and watch, how does the senior pastor make a decision, or how does Abel make a decision, and watching how decisions are made and the way people interact in that meeting is invaluable in developing them as leaders as well. So have an expanding top table. On top of that, I think there are 5 short things I'd love to finish with now that are really helpful in engaging with millennials. Some of these will be true of any age group, but in particular, I think they're pertinent for younger people. The first one is this, that as a church, we need to clarify the message. Clarify the message. And here, I'd say, where possible, preach heart transformation, not behavior modification. You preach the person of Jesus, not just the principles of Jesus. Ezekiel prophesied, didn't he, that a time would come when God would write his law, not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. And that's what the coming of the Holy Spirit on that first day of Pentecost ushered in, the fulfillment of that prophecy. We can tell people how they should behave, but actually, you first got to preach to the heart. Let the Holy Spirit soften the heart. And then the motivation comes to want to live in line with the teachings of Christ. And the principles of Jesus, just saying, well, do X, Y, and Z, that's not really the gospel. That's not the charisma. That's almost like Christian self-help. We've got to preach the person of Jesus, because it's Jesus that will transform us from the inside out. So clarify the message. The second thing would be this: connect before you correct. Jesus came, we're told in John 1, Jesus came in grace and truth. It's not the other way around, interestingly. It doesn't say he came in truth. He didn't come with truth and grace, but he came with grace and truth. And that's often how Jesus interacted with people. I think of the story of the woman caught in adultery that's about to be stoned. Jesus, at the end of that, when he's saved her from a gruesome ending, everybody's dropped their stones and walked away. He says to the woman, "Does no one condemn you?" She says, "No, sir." And he says, "Well, neither do I, grace." But then he says, "So go and sin no more." Truth. He came with grace and truth. It's best to connect before you correct. Or another way of putting it is, let people belong first of all, and then they'll believe, and then they'll behave. But often we want to reverse the process. You've got to behave, believe, then you can become a member and belong. It's not about membership. It's just about being embraced into the family of God, a place they can feel at home, a place where, again, if you think of your church as a home, regardless of how your children are or not behaving, they're still your children. They still belong, and they're valued. So connect before we correct. Third thing, and this is so important when you're engaging with millennials in your church. As a leader, you have to lead with brutal honesty. You can't hide behind the mask and pretend. You've got to be transparent. You've got to be real. You've got to be authentic. You don't have to be a Christian to be able to sniff out inauthenticity. Even somebody who's not a Christian, they can tell when you're authentic and when you're not authentic. And young people are particularly good at this. And I'm not saying, therefore, as leaders, we have to air all of our dirty laundry. No, I mean, you have to be wise in these matters. But gone are the days when you can lead with a false veneer. The world doesn't operate like that anymore. We tend to think that we'll impress people with our strengths, but actually, we connect with others through our vulnerabilities. So we need to lead with real honesty. In Romans chapter 12, Paul writes, and he says that love should be sincere. And the word there for sincere in the Greek is an hypokritos. The hypokritos, from which we get our word hypocrite. The hypokritos is what the mask was called that actors would wear in a play or a drama in the Greek world. All the actors would wear masks. But an hypokritos, the word for sincere, means without a mask. So if we're ever going to lead millennials and expect them to follow, we've got to take off the mask as a leader. So clarify the message, connect before you correct, lead with brutal honesty. Point 4, make passion your pursuit. Passion is so important in today's world. People are drawn to somebody who's passionate. If you're leading with honesty, they'll realize you're not perfect, but that's okay. They're not looking for a leader who's perfect. They're looking for a leader who passionately believes what they believe. When we get up to speak through not just what we say, but how we say it, our body language, our tone, people are subconsciously asking themselves 2 questions before they decide whether or not they're going to listen to you. Number 1, do I like them? And number 2, do I think they really believe what they're telling me? And one way in which we communicate that we genuinely believe what we're saying and that we walk the talk is through our passion. It was John Wesley who famously said this: light yourself with passion, and people will come from miles to watch you burn. So this means that we have to be passionate leaders for young people to follow. And that takes energy, right? that it takes energy to be passionate, but that's where the Holy Spirit comes in. We're not doing this in our own energy. The great thing is that when we pray, "Come, Holy Spirit," that oldest and ancient prayer of the church, it's like we're plugging into the main socket of life, the source, the creator, and then his Spirit flows through us and fills us with passion. As Paul writes to Timothy, he prays this prayer that God would fan into flame the gift of God that's already been placed in Timothy. So make passion your pursuit. And then finally, fifthly, in leading millennials, we need to walk in community. We can't be the Lone Ranger type leader. We have to allow people into our lives and do life together. Discipleship, of course, is best done life on life. The only way to lead these days is to lead relationally. You have to be relational in your leadership, and that means you have to be friends with people, invite them into your life. Paul, writing to the Thessalonians, says, not only did he teach them, but he let them into his life as well. Jesus did that with the disciples. He preached to the crowds. He sent out the 72, but he did have the 12. And actually within the 12, he had the 3. And then there was Peter. It's okay if you're in Christian leadership, it's okay not to spread yourself evenly amongst absolutely everybody that you pastor or that you serve. It's okay to pray and say, "Lord, who do you want me to particularly invest in?" Because if you're going to lead relationally and walk in community, sometimes people say, "Yeah, but that's not very scalable. Let's just run a leadership course and invite everybody to come to it. Then we can train hundreds, we can train thousands." Now, those sort of courses are great. But if you really want to develop leaders, you've got to do it up close and personal. And that is not scalable unless part of the way in which you train them is not just, "I'm investing in you," but who are you investing in as well? 2 Timothy 2, verse 2. Paul says, "All the things that you've heard me teach you in the presence of others, pass on to reliable people who will pass it on to others." 4 generations of discipling in one verse. Go and read it. Extraordinary verse. So pray, "Lord, who do you want me? Which millennials do you want me particularly to invest in, to invite into my life? Let them get up close. Be at the top table. Be at your dining room table." We tend to think that most teaching is done from the pulpit. Real discipling is done over the kitchen table. And lead relationally. And of course, with that comes accountability. And accountability flows both ways. Thank you so much for listening to myself and to Abel. I hope some of this is vaguely helpful. As Abel said, eat the fish, spit out the bones. I'm sure you're amazing leaders. You're doing extraordinary things. Thank you. Keep going. And together we know that Christ is building his church. We'll see the kingdom advance. We'll see this city. We'll see this state. We'll see this nation and the nations impacted for Christ. You have a really important part to play in the story. And it's been an absolute privilege just chatting with you right now. Thank you for listening.